the secret police in Syria knew about what I was doing. I got arrested in March 2011. I stayed in jail for around 40 days in Syria. And when I was released, Syria was different. People were in the streets protesting the regime.
My name is Adela Kochav.
And I'm Mariam Waba.
We are the Daughters of Diaspora.
And this is Americanish.
Welcome back to Americanish. This week we're talking about the wonderful country and the people of Syria. In the early morning of February 6th, a magnitude 7.8 earthquake ripped through Turkey and Syria, followed by 9 hours later, a 7.5 aftershock. 2 weeks later, on February 20th, an additional 6.3 magnitude earthquake struck the area. The loss of life and destruction across both countries is astonishing, just as the images and stories are heartbreaking.
Though Syria and Turkey were each hit hard, their media coverage and path to recovery look dramatically different. Unlike Turkey, which is a relatively modernized country, Syria is a nation divided in the midst of a now nearly 12-year civil war. We cannot discuss the effects of the earthquake without first understanding the history and geopolitics of the region. Today, we are so lucky and blessed to be joined by the wonderful Hadeel Oueis.
Hadeel is a writer and a news analyst focusing on U.S. and foreign policies for the Middle East. She analyzes UN foreign affairs for BBC Arabic, Deutsche Welle Arabic, AlHurrah, and other major Arabic networks. Hadeel was born and raised in northeast Syria and has advocated for democracy and minority rights in Syria during the years of the war.
Hadeel reported for years through the Jemina Voice platforms about Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews and has been an active voice in calling for peace in the Middle East. Currently, Hadeel is a senior research fellow at the Philos Project. Hadeel, welcome. We are so happy to have you with us today.
Happy to be with you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us. First off, we want to hear more about you. Who is Hadeel? How did you grow up and how did you make your way here to the United States?
So I was born in Syria, in northeast Syria, to a Syriac family. Syriac is a minority in Syria, a Christian minority. It's a minority of a minority. Christians are a minority in Syria, and Syriacs are a minority as well among the Christians in Syria. In 2011, this is how I like to start telling my story. In 2011, I was in my first year in college in Aleppo, not the city I was born in. And I started to hear about the news of the Arab Spring, what was happening in Tunisia, Egypt, and other Arab countries. And I was thinking that Syria needs democracy as well, and maybe Syria has a more brutal dictatorship than the ones in Tunisia and Egypt by far. So why we're not protesting as well? So I started to be active on the internet, in Facebook, calling for democracy, calling my colleagues in the college to protest the regime and to try to make a change, like the youth in Egypt and Tunisia. It didn't take too long until the secret police in Syria knew about what I was doing. It was not a lot, but they don't allow anyone to do anything against the regime. So I got arrested. I got arrested in March 2011. I was 19 years old back then. And it was a very hard experience. I stayed in jail for around 40 days in Syria. And when I was released, Syria was different because when I got into the jail, there were no protests in Syria yet. There were just people talking about it, people trying to change the reality in Syria. But when I went out, people were in the streets protesting the regime. I did not feel secure anymore in the country, and the country was not secure for anyone by that time. So my family decided that I have to leave Syria, and this is what we did. I just left Syria. I went to Sweden. I visited many countries until I ended up in the U.S. But what I want to mention here is my stay in Geneva. I stayed in Switzerland, in Geneva, where I met the U.S. delegation to Switzerland. I talked in the UN Human Rights Council and told my story, told the stories of the youth in Syria, told the story of the Arab Spring, that I believe it was not just a radical movement by Islamists. Of course, Islamists took over that movement. They had more support, more resources, more knowledge about how to be active in these countries. But I told the story to the world, and the U.S. delegation asked me if I want to come to the U.S., and I said, yes, of course, I'd love to. And a few months later, I came here, and I'm living in Washington, D.C. since then.
Oh, wow. That's a phenomenal story. And I mean, it's crazy to hear about young activists who actually, do more than talk. They actually put their actions front and center. So first off, I commend you for all of your work. I can't imagine how those experiences must have been for you. Do you still have family in Syria?
Not really. I have people that I know. I have some friends, but in the area where I came from, northeast Syria, and where we have U.S. troops there now, there is not a lot of Christians left. There is small community, but not a lot of Christians left because they suffered. ISIS emerged in that area, in precise, more than any other areas in Syria. So that caused most of the Christians to leave. My family left 2 years later after me, and they are in Sweden now. I have like almost 50 people from my big family who immigrated within few years to Sweden.
Wow, that's phenomenal. Being a Syrian Christian, a lot of people, when they hear Syria, they definitely don't think of other religious minorities. So how has being a Syrian Christian been for you? And in Syria, when you were growing up, did you live in a big Christian, specifically, community? And then coming to the U.S., have you been able to find a diaspora version of that community?
Yes, of course. So the Syrian Christian community is a minority. It used to be almost in the 60s, 10%, 11% of the population, but it declined in the 80s, in the 90s, and we became around 6% in 2011. And of course, after the war, after 2011, the numbers declined even more. And although the Christians were a minority, they had a very remarkable impact in the country, in Syria. You see them everywhere. You see them in educational sectors. You see them in most of the important institutes in Syria. So they are everywhere. They were even in the government. There were like many defense ministers for Syria who were Christians, many foreign affairs ministers who were Christians. So they had a big impact on the culture, on the art in Syria, on the cuisine. But of course, this is fading with time because the numbers are not as before, and the capabilities, the ability of the Christians to be active, to speak out, to say we are here, our culture is here, is not the same as before.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, first, that's an amazing story, and I'm so happy you and your family are now here in the U.S. and safe. I wonder, so obviously you were a threat to the regime because you were a dissenter and you were doing anti-regime activities, including on Facebook and protesting in the streets. Was there any part of the arrest or during the arrest, was your Christian identity brought into the mess you were causing?
So the regime wanted and tried to tell me the same story that they tried to tell the world, that this movement is a radical, extremist, Islamist movement, and it's not in your interest as a Christian. They were telling me in the jail, are you crazy? Why are you with these people? Because the group that I was arrested with are colleagues from Aleppo University, and most of them are, of course, Muslim Sunnis, but I like them. They are my friends. We have a lot in common, and I never believed the theory of the regime. I agree that the movement later on became very extremist, very radical in Syria. Extremists took over everything, but this is how they portrayed it for me. They tried to convince me that this is not in the interest of my people, and at the end, the one who helped release me, because most of the times when you go to jail in Syria, you never go out. The one who helped me was Bishop Yohanna Ibrahim, who I really miss, and we all miss now. He was kidnapped by unknown groups in Aleppo a few years later, but he's the one who helped me get released. He came to the security center that I was arrested in, and he guaranteed that I won't go against the regime again, and he helped me get out of that jail. So another time that my Christian identity came up during my stay in jail was that Bishop Yohanna Ibrahim, the bishop of the Syriac Orthodox Church in Aleppo, was the one who helped me to get released. My family did not know anything about me for days, and when they heard that I'm in jail in Aleppo, the first one they thought about was the bishop of our church. So they asked him to help, and he helped me. He came to the jail where I stayed, and he told them that he guarantees that I won't do any harm for this country. I'm not a bad person, and I'm not also going to go against this regime anymore. And this is how I was released.
And it's interesting when we look at the Arab Spring across all Arab nations that experienced some sort of Arab Spring, in that the regimes at the time tried to convince everybody that the revolutions or the attempted revolutions were Islamist undertakings. And at some point they did become so, because you had institutions like the Muslim Brotherhood hijacking the revolutions and capitalizing on the moment of weak government to swoop in and take. So it's interesting to hear you say that that's the case for Syria too. And I want to dig in a little bit into the Arab Spring, which we'll get into in a sec. But first, I want to zoom out and talk about Syria as a modern nation, which didn't exist until about 1919 with the fall of the Ottoman Empire. This makes Syria a relatively young nation, and I'm sure you've done this a million times before, but can you give us a brief rundown of what is Syria, who is Syria, what is the demographic, what does Syria as a nation mean?
So Syria is a relatively medium-sized Middle East country. It is new, as you said, Mariam. It was ruled by military councils between 1919, the fall of the Ottoman Empire, until the 70s. And so there were no stability, no clear system that was in control of Syria until the 70s, early 70s. Al-Ba'ath Party, Hafez al-Assad, the Assad family took over Syria, and since then Syria is under the control of the Assad family. The Assad family is an Alawite family. It is closer to the Shia Muslims, while the majority of the Syrians are Sunnis, the Sunni Muslims. So for decades the Sunnis felt that it's unfair that this minority is controlling Syria, and of course in a very undemocratic system. There is no real elections that took place in Syria since ever. This is Syria, but the Assad family, especially Hafez al-Assad, the father of the current president Bashar al-Assad, he was a strong man, and he was relatively a smart man, comparing him to other Arab leaders back then. So this is why Syria had a big influence and big impact in the region, in the Middle East. Syria was a main player in the Arab-Israeli conflict. Syria led or tried to lead many failed wars against Israel. Syria also invaded Lebanon for years. Al-Assad family was not only controlling Syria but also Lebanon as well. This is why many Lebanese until today they don't really like Syria. But in 2011 they started to know that Syrians don't like the regime that controlled them. So they started to know more about Syria. Syria was a very closed country. If we compare it to Lebanon, if we compare it to Egypt, if we compare it to Jordan, Syria is the Korea of the Middle East. It was close to everything. Syrians say many jokes about things that they didn't know, things that did not exist. We had only one TV channel until late 90s. The Assad regime did not allow Syrians to eat bananas. There were no bananas in Syria until very late time. There were no yes, I know it's funny.
That sounds terrible. No bananas.
So were all these decisions, Hadeel, a conscious choice of the regime, of the Assad family and their control to limit the exposure that Syria and Syrians had?
To any other cultures. So yes, this is why Syria was very late. And I always think that things get very much worse than other places after the Arab Spring, because the Syrian people were not exposed. Were not exposed to any other political ideas, any other languages. Like people in Egypt or Lebanon, they speak English, they speak French more than the Syrian people. Even in Jordan, a very poor country with a lot of troubles and conflicts, they are exposed more to other cultures. So yes, this is Syria, and until 2011, some people who are interested in politics, who are interested in the Arab Spring, started to know about protests in Syria, the war in Syria, a dictator who is killing thousands of his people, but Syria became really very well known when ISIS emerged. The very ugly extremist group emerged. It emerged from Syria and Iraq, and mainly Syria, because the capital of ISIS was in Syria, in the middle of Syria, 2 hours far from the city that I was born in eastern Syria, Raqqa.
Hadeel, you bring up really interesting points, and I have a few follow-up questions on that. But first, I want to remind everybody listening that there was a time period where Egypt and Syria merged to create one country. Was it the 1950s, Hadeel?
1975 till 1960.
Oh, wow. Okay. It was much later than I thought. For how long were they together?
Almost 2 years, but it was very troubling time. All of it was
right. Yeah, there was the United Arab Republic.
Yes,
and it was a product of Nasser's attempt at Arab nationalism, trying to create an Arab nation. So he proposed to some political leaders in Syria to merge, and they created this country called the United Arab Republic. And there's this funny joke that actually a Syrian told me. He said Nasser would have been successful if he didn't have as many opinions as he had from the Syrians. There were just as many people trying to topple Nasser as there are many Syrians in the world. Which gives you a little bit of insight into what that time period looked like. My question for you, given this context of Syria was closed off to the world, what is the relationship like between Syria and other Arab countries? And not necessarily politically, even linguistically, culturally. What relationship existed in the past, and what does it look like today?
One of the fathers of the Arab nationalism, maybe after Jamal Abdel Nasser, was Hafez al-Assad, the president, the late president of Syria, the father of the current president. So Arabism was a big thing in our curriculums. It was a big thing in our national TV. So they always told us that we are all Arabs. Like, for example, I'm Syriac, I'm not Arab, but we're not allowed to say that everyone is Arab. But if you dig in the relations when it comes to on the political levels between Hafez al-Assad and other Arab countries, it was not very good because, as I mentioned before, the Assad regime is an Alawite regime. It's a Shia minority, while most of the Arab countries were ruled by Sunni Muslim governments. So Assad was always somehow on the side of Iran, more closer to Iran than the Arabs. He did not trust the Arab countries, and they did not trust him as well. So Syria was on the brink of starting a war with Iraq, for example. There were many big and ugly disputes between Syria and the Gulf countries like Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, many other Gulf countries. Syria had, I mentioned before, Syria invaded Lebanon. So there were a lot of troubles between the Syrian government and other Arab governments, but they always told us that we are Arabs. This is the first and most important identity for us. And it's funny that after 2011, when the Arab Spring started and Arab countries like the Gulf countries started to support the Syrian opposition, the Assad regime started to say that Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Qatar, those are not Arabs. We are the Arabs. So although if you think about it as an ethnicity, even maybe the Muslims in Syria are not totally Arabs. So
Right. Yeah.
Arabs in the Gulf. So, but they started to say that Arabism is ours. We made it. Yes. So, yeah.
This question of who's an Arab and who is not remains like one of the biggest questions that comes across people who study or engage with the Middle East. And we did a few episodes back, we did like a little 10-minute segment trying to explain what the word Arab means, because technically speaking, although Hadeel and I both speak Arabic and we're Syria and Egypt respectively, technically we're not really Arabs because we're Christians, and Hadeel is Syriac, I'm Coptic, but this question of who's an Arab is really a huge one, and it really came up a lot during the Arab Spring too.
Yes.
Yeah, actually, Hadeel, in one of our earlier episodes, we had a lot of controversy around whether or not Jewish people from the Middle East are allowed to call themselves Arab Jews. And we got a lot of pushback from people who are Arab and not Jewish, and a lot of pushback from Jews who say that Jews can't be Arab. So we actually did a whole segment. I had my 23andMe results, and I'm 92% Middle East and North African. So it became like this kind of like weird thing where it's like, well, do I trust my DNA? Do I trust my family history? Do I trust the fact that my family came from the region? So, I'll talk a little bit about that before we get back into the hard politics. So for our listeners who have heard this a couple of times before, as you know, I am a Jew from Syria and Lebanon. So my family on my dad's side was actually in Kilis, which is now part of Turkey, but back in the day it was Greater Syria. Everything was Greater Syria during the Ottoman Empire. So they were in Kilis, and there's a weird folkloric story about my family. Apparently, close to the end of the First World War, apparently my great-grandpa got into a fight with the Sheikh's son, and apparently he knocked out his eyeball. Again, we have no idea how truthful any of this is. So he had to flee to avoid death, so he fled to Aleppo. He was in Aleppo for a couple of years, and they said, they're going to come after you, and you have to leave, or else they're going to kill you. So he got on a boat and ended up in Mexico, of all places. So that's on my dad's side of the story. And on my mom's side of the family, they were living in Lebanon. They were actually in Beirut. They were living in Damascus, and they were working in Beirut. So my grandpa would, wake up every morning, go to Beirut, and then come back to Damascus. And then apparently there was just one day after the split happened where he just kind of got stuck in Beirut, and he was like, okay, I guess I'm Beiruti now. And then my grandpa was born there, and then my family ended up moving also to Mexico, which has a very big Lebanese and Syrian Jewish communities. And we always talk about the diversity of the Middle East, how people never really realize that there's Christians living in the Middle East and that Jews used to live in a lot of these countries. So it's it's funny that you said like the idea of like pan-Arabism, who can be an Arab, who's allowed to call themselves an Arab. And then if you have history in the Middle East, but you're not an Arab, are you an Arab? How does your religious history play into whether or not you're an Arab? But let's turn that back around and let's talk about the Arab Spring. So we talked about the Arab Spring a little bit earlier, and you told us your experience personally in the Arab Spring. But for our listeners who don't know, the Arab Spring was a series of rebellions across the Middle East fighting for civil liberties, fair wages, freedom of speech, and against their leaders' corruption. A lot of Middle Eastern countries saw, at least at first, some progress after the Arab Spring, and then others fell into more repressive regimes, and Syria was one of them. So what was the effect of the Arab Spring on Syria? You said after you left prison, you saw more people standing up, but now, 10 years out, what was the effect of the Arab Spring?
Yes, so unfortunately, the most remarkable, the most seen impact and effect is a negative one. It turned very quickly into a civil war in Syria. It started with ambitious young people like the one I was a decade ago. And we wanted change in Syria, and it very quickly turned into a civil war. Today, Syria is very devastated, very poor country. It was not the best before 2011. I mentioned before how closed and how hard was it to live in Syria, but it is still hard now, and of course it's harder. Assad regime did not want to go easily, did not want to change his behavior as well. Syria has been under U.S. sanctions for almost 8 years now, and of course the sanctions are improving the country even more. There is no investment, no foreign investment in Syria. We used to have some of it that started to come after 2005. Now there is no foreign investment. The war that was very brutal because when the people protested, the protests were mainly in Sunni cities. The Muslim Sunnis revolted against the regime, and when they saw that the regime is facing just peaceful protesters with fighters, with tanks, they decided that they're gonna also use weapons against him. And of course, many countries in the region started to send weapons to the protesters, to Sunni militias that organized themselves very quickly, that have the ideological background and the ideological support from Muslim Brotherhood, from many other groups. And Al-Qaeda jumped in, ISIS emerged. So Assad started to also escalate even more. He asked Russia and Iran with all their heavy weapons for help. And this is how many cities were totally destroyed, totally wiped out in Syria. Now there are cities in Aleppo, in Homs, in Hama, in Daraa, all these Syrian cities that are totally destroyed, and they look exactly how the cities in Turkey and other areas in Syria now look with the earthquake.
So actually, I have a question about that. We talk about the Civil War, but for our listeners who don't know, who are the major players in the Civil War? What are the groups that are fighting each other?
So, as I mentioned, that it started with peaceful protests when these Sunni cities saw that the regime is going after them with heavy weapons. They started to also fight the regime with weapons. But it's not like all the civilians started militias against the regime. It was certain people who have the experience, who fought before in places like Iraq, in Iraq War, mainly extremists. Most of the people who joined these militias that fought the regime were unfortunately extremists. So it was mainly between Sunni militias and the regime, the Syrian army. But of course, the Syrian army was so huge, was so large. It was almost 200,000 fighters. Many of them were Muslim Sunnis, and they descended from the main Syrian army and joined the Sunni militias and said, well, now we are part of the opposition, the armed opposition. So there were the armed opposition. Some of it is just civilians who joined the militias. Others are descendants from the army and the Syrian regime, who is Alawite. But when the Syrian regime started to feel that he is outnumbered by Sunni fighters, because the Sunnis population in Syria is almost 80%, while the Alawites, Christians, and others are almost 20%. So when he felt that he is outnumbered, he asked Russia for help. So Russia became also a player in this war, but not on the ground. Russia was helping him more from the air by the airstrikes, but also, of course, he asked Iran for help because he has this mutual background, ideological Shia Alawite background with Iran. So Iran joined the war with all its militias that came from Lebanon, came from even Yemen, came from Afghanistan, came from Pakistan, and also escalated this war even more.
Wow.
Yeah, and I want to highlight something, Hadeel, you're hitting on right now, and just make it very clear. Syria is a case of a minority ruling a majority. And I maybe want you to explain a little bit more, Hadeel, what is an Alawite and a Sunni, and why there's this disconnect between the ruling party being Alawite and not Sunni, being part of the majority.
So it happened, let me answer the last question first. The Alawite controlled Syria just because the late president Hafez al-Assad was too smart. He played the pan-Arabism game very well. He convinced everyone around him that his main and most important identity is the Arab identity and nothing else, not his religious background. Although many historians write today that Hafez al-Assad was a very religious Alawite man, and he only believed in his Alawite faith. So, but he convinced everyone that pan-Arabism is his top priority, and he controlled it. And when he controlled Syria, he started to put Alawites in charge of the most important positions in Syria, especially the security institutes, the army, the most important infrastructure and economic sectors. And this is how the Alawites became stronger and stronger with time. And it was very hard to topple them down because of many reasons, not only internal reasons, but also the international community, the United States, since the time of Hafez al-Assad, always feared that the alternative of this Alawite regime that is going to be a radical Sunni alternative. I'm not trying to say that all the Sunnis of Syria are radicals. That's absolutely not right. But this is what the West feared, because when a Sunni group is powerful enough to topple down this very strong and tough regime, unfortunately, they are the extremist one. They are the one who has the resources. They are the one who has the ideology, while the liberal Sunnis of the big cities, the wealthiest family of the Sunni Muslims of Syria, were not powerful or strong enough or they don't have the tools to topple down this regime. They are just like me, like anyone who tried to change Syria with peaceful means, but they could not. So this is how the Alawites became in charge in Syria. and the international community always feared toppling down this regime, as they feared to do so after 2011. There were a big chance that Assad can go and we just change the regime, put in a Sunni or any other president in charge. But there were always this fear from the alternative. Yes, and what was the other question, Mariam?
No, I think you answered it. I was just trying to highlight the fact that part of the struggle with Syria is that you have a minority ruling a majority, but the minority calls on powers much stronger than the minority to come to its aid, including Iran and Russia. And you have the Alawites, the Assad family, using gas against their own people and committing massive human rights atrocities against a majority Sunni population. And I think sometimes that gets lost in a lot of the lingo when people talk about Syria. And it's a very simple thing. It's a minority ruling a majority, and that causes tensions. But I think it gets lost. We want to turn our attention to the earthquake. At the very beginning of this episode, we mentioned that Syria was getting considerably less media attention than Turkey post-earthquake. And really, if we're being technical about it, Turkey and Syria experienced 3 major earthquakes in the past 2 weeks. And there are some legitimate reasons for why Syria is getting way less attention on Western media with regards to this earthquake and the path to recovery. Can you talk us through some of why that is the case?
So, Syria has been under very strong sanctions from the U.S., a law called Caesar Action, since 2015. And this is gradually preventing any other country, any organization from dealing with Syria. Everyone is hesitant of doing so. Now, if I go to a bank and ask them that I want to send money to a family in Syria, the bank won't allow me. They will kick me out because I'm saying I want to send money to Syria. Although the law says that humanitarian aid, humanitarian issues are not included in the sanctions. We're talking about, when we talk about private sector, when we talk about businesses, when we talk about banks, organizations, everyone do not want to deal with Syria. They just don't want this headache. So this is why it's very hard now to help Syria. And because no one can help Syria, Syria is also not in the news. And I think also because solving the problem, solving the biggest issues that caused the war in Syria is another reason for why the media just ignored Syria. We remember a few years ago when Assad used the chemical weapons against his own people, President Barack Obama said, that's the red line and I want to do something. But President Biden faced very hard options. All the options were very hard. He did not want to topple down the Assad regime because the radical militias were already in the streets of Syria. And all it took is an airstrike that could kill the Assad and the radical militias, including ISIS and Al-Qaeda, of course, who took over the country. So he did not have a lot of options. He targeted few facilities for Assad, but it was not powerful. And since then, the world decided to forget about Syria because there is a reason now why we see Ukraine in the news every day, because there is a political action toward Ukraine. Here in the White House, the briefing we hear every day from the State Department, it's all about Ukraine. And this is what the media cover. They cover what the White House does, what the State Department does, what the president, where is President Biden. So because Syria is forgotten by politicians, it's also forgotten by media. And it is forgotten in a case like the earthquake as well.
It's really a shame. It's a shame because in Syria, what we've been hearing from the news for the last, 10 years is about a country whose leadership doesn't care about its own people. And it's one thing when a government is causing problems for its own people the way that Syria has. And it's another when a natural tragedy strikes and you have two nations that are hit by the same tragedy, and one of them will hopefully recover. And Syria, realistically, we don't know what recovery will look like there. Now, I know that this has been a very heavy topic, but we do like to end our episodes with a happier note. So before we sign off, being Syrian, I'm Syrian, you're Syrian, and Mariam is from Egypt, we want to ask you your favorite food from your home country. So what is your favorite Syrian cuisine?
Yes, so I love the cuisine from Aleppo. I love the food in Aleppo. I think it's the best. It is very diverse, more than any other place in Syria. And I love the food that's cooked with tomato sauce. I love tomato sauce. And,
Me too.
I love kusa mahshi, which is a stuffed
I was
zucchini.
about to say, do you like mahshi kusa? Yeah, okay,
Yes.
continue.
So I really love it. I do it here for my family. They also eat Syrian food. This is what we eat most of the days. My daughter is trying to resist Syrian food sometimes, but I don't
She'll
know.
come around. She'll come around. It's a give and take. You got to give and you got to take.
Yeah.
Yes,
We always
exactly.
talk about our rebellion phases.
Yes,
So she will come around to the mahshi kusa. We love the mahshi.
she should, yes.
Thank you
Hopefully.
so much for joining us, Hadeel, and thank you for letting us take a stab at exploring Syria and all of its beauty and pain. It's really been a pleasure. And thank you for tuning into Americanish. We will see you next week.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mariam and Adela.
Thank you for tuning in for another episode of Americanish. For more exclusive content, subscribe to us on Instagram. See you next week.